The first Nobel Peace Prize was jointly awarded to two men, Henri Dunant and Frederik Passy. Frederik Passy worked to prevent wars through international arbitration congresses. Henri Dunant accepted war but tried to alleviate the suffering of those involved by founding the International Red Cross and protecting care providers with the Geneva Convention. The era in which they worked was one of frequent wars and terrible slaughter on a massive scale. But it was also an era of social advancement.
The pacifism at times in history is more acceptable to people than others. But as soon as people get nervous, because of economic reasons, political reasons, could be racial reasons, whatever, unfortunately we resort to warfare.
If you look at Europe in 1800, almost every country is a monarchy with no constitution. And by 1900, it's the triumph of the bourgeois over the ancient regime or the old aristocracy, in which most of the Western European countries are democratic, have an elected parliament of one form or another, and have a constitution. The Constitution is the great weapon of the middle class against the aristocracy because it sets the rules. And part of that setting of rules is to look, is it possible to have rules for war?
So I think that coinciding with the idea that wars were going to be more and more destructive as they occurred, produced a plethora of peace activities, peace congresses, things like that. So I think it was just a timing where industry was at that time, the mechanization of war.
The new weapons are horrific. The Gatling gun at the end of the American Civil War, the repeater rifle, both of which get used in the Franco-Prussian War, produce a kind of chaos, and the numbers in the armies swell. The reaction to that is to bring about a high degree of pacifism and a real effort to limit warfare.
And Alfred Nobel is a curious figure because he believed that dynamite, the production of dynamite, would in fact help bring about peace instead of war. Because he tells this advocate of world peace, her name is Bertha von Sutter, and he says, quote, "My factories may make an end to war sooner than your peace congresses. The day when two army corps will annihilate each other in 1 second, all civilized nations, it is to be hoped, will recoil from war and discharge their troops." Well, pacifism relies on the goodwill of human beings and believing that there's at least a quasi-rational universe, that people will not destroy one another.
The Enlightenment thinkers, particularly in Great Britain, as well as in France, but particularly in Great Britain, thought that war was an anomaly. It was something that was not part of the human character, but I've been a historian now for almost 50 years, and wars continue. There are over 40 of conflicts going on the planet right now. I doubt it's going away. But can it be controlled, and can it be channeled? And I think through institutions, through treaties, through conventions, it can be, to some degree, inhibited. So there's been an attempt, too, to develop rules for warfare through international law. And that began with Hugo Gratius in the 1600s, manifested itself to some degree in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1649, in which countries recognized sovereignty. The biggest problem with international law, unlike national law, is there are no cops, there is no police force, there's no international army. There have been discussions for the last 100 years whether or not that should be the case.
Henri Dunant was a Swiss businessman whose company grew and traded corn in French Algeria. However, the land and water rights for the region were not clearly defined. After having difficulty with the local officials, Dunant chose to meet with Napoleon III directly at his headquarters in Solferino. However, the emperor at the time was assisting the Italians in the Second War of Independence. The direction of Dunant's life would change dramatically when he arrived in Solferino on the unfortunate date of June 24, 1859.
He happened to be in Italy in 1859 when the Italians were involved in war with the Austro-Hungarians, and a battle was fought at the Battle of Solferino. And the wounded were basically left on the battlefield, and he was horrified by that event and went home and decided that something needed to be done to try to deal with the wounded, and pushed for the idea and founded the idea of the International Committee for the Red Cross. That led to the idea of putting forth an international convention that would protect the wounded, and in 1864 the convention met in Europe and 12 countries signed on. Over the course of time, a huge number of countries signed on to the Geneva Convention. The United States, Clara Barton, pushed hard for the U.S. To sign the convention, but that didn't happen until 1882.
The Geneva Convention, ratified in 1864, was the first of 4 treaties. It guaranteed the humane treatment of sick and injured soldiers. It also protected the International Red Cross and any other impartial humanitarian organizations. In 1906, a second treaty was added in response to the Russo-Japanese War. This treaty expanded the application of the original convention to naval conflict. A third treaty, in 1929, added prisoners of war to the groups protected by the Geneva Convention. In 1949, another treaty extended the protections of the convention to civilians. 2 protocols in 1977 updated the convention to account for advances in warfare and to protect people involved in non-international conflicts. The most recent addition came in 2005. Protocol 3 clarified the rules for the use of the protective emblem. Frederik Passy's work was also instigated by war. He founded the League of Arbitration Between Nations after his previous peace congress, the International and Permanent League of Peace, was broken up by the Franco-Prussian War.
He saw the destructive nature of the Franco-German War. So he saw what that brought about. And he believed that there must be a better way, a different option that would bring about reconciliation, peace, maybe not human happiness, but at least the end of human slaughter. Yeah, he was a person that believed in international arbitration, a neutral party. That's what arbitration is. So the neutral party that can help us to facilitate our differences. We may both not be happy about the result, but given the fact that we know the result of going to war will be catastrophic, we can at least try to resolve this issue nonviolently. And there was a dispute between France and Netherlands. It had to do with, I think, the Guyana in Africa. And it was an international dispute. It looked like that they were ready to go to war. And he said, let's sit down and arbitrate it. Let's rationally talk about it, see if we can reconcile it. And he was successful in that. How many lives were saved in the process, I don't know.
In 1901, Frederik Passy and Henri Dunant were both awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Frederik Passy continued his advocacy for peace and arbitration and was a renowned speaker. The Apostle of Peace, as he came to be known, also authored a number of books on pacifism. His last book, For Peace, was written in 1909. He died in 1912, but his ideas of negotiating international conflicts are still in use today.
The UN has been at least semi-effective in various areas, but yes, there's been a number of disputes in Africa, in Asia, in which arbitration has been used. And the UN is founded on a belief, of course, that people can resolve disputes, international disputes, nonviolently.
When he received the Nobel Prize in 1901, Henri Dunant was not the great businessman he once was. In 1867, his business had gone bankrupt from mismanagement as his focus had turned to his humanitarian work. Within a few years, he was living as a beggar and assumed dead. In 1890, he was found in the Swiss village of Heiden. The teacher Wilhelm Sonderegger, who found him, provided him a room at the local hospice and announced to the world that he was in fact still alive. Despite the admiration and prizes Dunant received upon his rediscovery, he never moved from his room 12 in the hospice. He never spent any of the Nobel Prize award money. Instead, he donated it to philanthropic enterprises in Norway and Sweden. His impact on history was immense. The Geneva Convention changed the way that countries behaved in war.
Generally, it's not the specific events that are as important as the idea that this gave prisoners a weapon and gave countries a weapon to use against people who would not follow the rules. And what could happen in those cases would be public pressure, international pressure, exposure, journalistic exposure, all of whom would put pressure on different countries to comply with the rules. It is true that both the Japanese and the Germans oftentimes violated it, tortured and killed prisoners, but they knew that if they lost the war, they would be held accountable for it. So one of the important things also is not just international pressure from coalitions, but the idea that you could face a tribunal and that you could be tried for crimes against war crimes. But all during World War II and later, prisoners tried to be able to use the convention to be able to protect themselves. You can see this in the great movie, 1950s movie, Bridge on the River Kwai.
I mean, we have Geneva Conventions today. Do we practice it? Waterboarding, for example? I mean, we argue whether that's acceptable or not acceptable. Yes, we don't do certain things like poison gas, etc. But the truth is we will resort to anything that is necessary. And I don't blame the troops, and I don't even blame their superiors. It's just an illusion that we can fight a, quote, good moral war. Wars are not good, and they're not moral, and that's what they are, and we need to understand it. Because we still feel we can limit wars, even nuclear wars. The concept of limiting nuclear wars is ludicrous. The concept of limiting any wars is ludicrous.
Let me give you the bad news, I guess, first. The last century was probably the most violent century in human history except the 13th century. But in fact, the good news is this. The first half of the 20th century was a lot more violent than the second half of the 20th century. And how much of that is attributable to developments in international law and attempts to limit limit warfare, as well as to the bomb. I think that the atomic bomb has worked as an inhibiting factor on international war. And it has produced caution in the wars that have occurred since 1945.
The Red Cross has also had great impact on world affairs of the last century.
And what happens when war actually breaks out. I think the war, because of nationalism in the war, kind of shattered the idea of an international movement. They downplayed internationalism and played up the nationalism.
One of the problems for the International Red Cross that started out as a great asset was the problem of neutrality, particularly in World War II. The International Red Cross knew that Jews were being executed. They didn't have a full handle on the Holocaust, but they had a good idea and knew of particular cases when horrific things were happening in Europe, but they didn't speak out. And the reason they didn't is because by taking a neutral position, they were able to aid some Jews and other people and prisoners in Europe, which they might not have done had they come out with an anti-Nazi or anti-German position.
The Red Cross was one of the important service organizations in the war. It had various parts to it, various components. That one of the big ones was nurses, supplying nurses for the armed forces. But they also did a lot of fundraising during the war. This is a photo album for the canteen, the American Red Cross canteen at Union stations, and they set up these canteens, which are like little stores. So they would be staffed by Red Cross personnel from the local area, and they would help servicemen coming through the station. They gave away usually coffee, tea. They had drinks. They'd have candy. They'd have cigarettes and so forth. There was a list of places where they could stay overnight. They taught classes on health and on first aid. So they were the intermediary, the organization that worked with prisoners of war, worked with countries to ensure that prisoners of war had decent living conditions, making sure that they were treated properly, that they were housed properly and fed properly, and that's from the Geneva Conventions about the kind of rules of war and the treatment of prisoners.
The International Red Cross has received 3 Nobel Peace Prizes of its own, in 1917, 1944, and 1963. Henri Dunant even had an award named after him, the Henri Dunant Medal, which is given out every 2 years by the Red Cross. Henri Dunant died on October 30th, 1910. In his later years, he had become increasingly depressed and paranoid. In his will, he refused a funeral ceremony, procession, or mourning. Instead, he chose to be carried to his grave like a dog. His birthday, May 8th, is celebrated as International Red Cross and Red Crescent Society Day. Though his funeral was modest, several monuments have been built in his honor. Today, the hospice where he lived for 20 years has been made into the Henri Dunant Museum.